Welcome back to the Hardware Unbox podcast for episode 62. We finally have RDNA information, RDNA 4 information. We've got the actual prices for the cards now, the performance claims that AMD have made, some of the features that they've been talking about, and we're going to break it all down based on actual information this time. We get to talk about the value proposition and that sort of thing. And yeah, thankfully it is not $650 because this would have been a very depressing episode. It's maybe not as good as we were hoping for, but still not as terrible as that. So let's break down everything. This will be a very interesting episode if you've been listening to the past couple of episodes. So let's get into it. All right, Steve, we are burning the midnight oil here. This is a late one.
Well, we don't have a choice, do we?
No, not really. I mean, the announcement for us local time is midnight. So we thought, is this worth a midnight podcast? And I think we came to the conclusion that sleep, we can do that at any time. But talking about AMD GPU prices we need to get this out now, even though we'll probably put it out in the morning. But anyway.
It didn't really make sense, did it, to film it at our normal sort of Friday slot? Because we've already speculated as to what the price could be, what we think AMD will do, what that means. We've already made that podcast. So there's no point having that same discussion again. But there's been a lot of fallout from that initial discussion, which I'm sure we can, if we have the energy, possibly get to. But we finally have the price, the specifications, and a pretty good idea on where performance should be.
Yeah, that's right. So RX 9070 XT is coming in at $600 US. The 9070 non-XT version is coming in at $550 US. And yeah, so we have to know what the performance is to make any sort of context of those numbers. By themselves, they're irrelevant. So the 9070 XT, at least based on claims of 42% better 4K gaming performance over the 7900 GRE, implies that performance is going to be around 10% better than a 7900 XT. So somewhere between the 7900 XT and 7900 XTX, probably based on those numbers, 5070 Ti level rasterization performance. That number, when we say 42% better, by the way, is a combination of both rasterized and ray tracing gains. The average that AMD showed for rasterized gains was around 37%, and for ray tracing was a bit over 50%. So that should probably put ray tracing performance somewhere around a 4070 Super, maybe 4070 Ti in the best cases. And then with the RX 9070, the non-XT version, they're claiming 20% better than a 7900 GRE. So that should be a little slower than a 7900 XT, if that holds up based on our testing at least. Potentially a little faster than a 4070 Super, which we're expecting to be around the level of a 5070, just based on the hardware specs of the 5070. That's kind of what we're expecting. So yeah, potentially maybe 10 to 15% faster raster than the 4070 Super / 5070, and then ray tracing is going to be a bit slower than that, probably between 7900 XT and XTX level with the 9070 XT. These names are really hard to follow. We're just getting used to them.
It's bad. It's really bad.
9070 XT, slightly more ray tracing performance than the XTX from the previous generation. So that's where things lie. I've made the news video with that sort of my analysis. So I'm really keen to hear what your thoughts are, considering you've said a few things in the podcast last week, but also on Twitter and a few other places. So some of that was me, to be fair, but yeah. So where are you seeing things?
Yeah. When I first heard the price, I couldn't tell if I was happy or disappointed with $600, $599. It's realistically probably a best case scenario. There was just no way they were going to do the $550 price, which the market has pretty much indicated that they need to do if they want to sell these well. We can talk a bit more about that a bit later on. $650 was going to be a truly awful price, just dead on arrival type pricing.
Yeah, and to give some context to that, because I think we should start there. I know I want to continue going into your thoughts, but the reason why we were so against the $650 price and why it would have been dead on arrival is that the 7900 XT has been $700 US for pretty much all of 2024. So that is the real price. If we're talking 5070 Ti's are really $900, while 7900 XTs are even more really $700. And so if AMD is to offer about 10% more performance based on these performance numbers for $50 less, I mean, it's not exactly a good improvement.
No,
Very underwhelming improvement.
You're getting less VRAM. I don't think that's terribly relevant for this particular matchup, but it's still a factor. You are losing some VRAM capacity.
Yeah, it'd be about 15% more to buy a 5070 Ti. We're expecting to have better ray tracing performance, DLSS, that sort of thing. Again, you're probably not convincing too many people at that price.
There's also just our opinion, having very carefully and I don't know, a lot of depth with our analysis on these different GPUs, right? It's not like we've just, we're not sitting on X like, some people just randomly throwing out our personal opinions. It's backed by boatloads of testing, careful consideration of the results, and there's a lot of market sort of stuff in there as well. Like we talk with distributors, retailers, find out how things are selling. But there's sort of two opinions in here that are getting blurred together, which confused us, at least some people on the previous podcast. So previously with the Ryzen 7000 series, you and I, after many back and forth discussions, came to the opinion that a 20% discount was required for a solid recommendation from us. And a 20% discount is what gamers should be happy to invest in Radeon for.
So that was RDNA 3, Radeon 7000 series, RX 7000 series. We thought 20% was about it. So AMD achieved that with the 7900 XTX versus the 4080 at launch. And they also achieved that with the 7800 XT versus the 4070 at launch.
That opinion gets a little muddied, a little convoluted, because with the 7900 XTX and the RTX 4080, although they did achieve that margin there, so we sort of just applied this and thought that would work, but then we didn't consider the huge range at which GPUs sell for now. And when you get to $1,000, it's like $1,000, $1,200. Is that enough money to save to not get the best product? And let's be real here. Let's be perfectly clear here. The GeForce GPU is the superior product. If you argue otherwise, you're in fantasy land. The GeForce GPU is better. How much better depends on the kind of features you want to use and all that sort of stuff. The Radeon GPUs can certainly be better value, and that's the argument. But if you're spending $1,000, we know based on the evidence, and it's just, to me, it's logical, right? If you're spending $1,000, it's not a huge stretch to get to $1,200 for the best. And that's what people are always weighing up when they spend their money, like product segmentation. So I'm comfortable spending this much money, but an extra $50, an extra $100, how much more does that get me? And if it is quite a substantial upgrade, they'll often do that. So the 20% thing there, but then as you get to the lower end of the market, 20% obviously is a smaller dollar figure, but then people, the budgets are tighter. So, $50, for example, becomes a meaningful amount of money, whereas $200 at the high end may not be. So, but anyway, in general, just because it's so, you can't come up with different formulas for every single price point. And again, there's stuff like, we've said ray tracing at the low end, not terribly relevant. Even upscaling becomes less relevant because upscaling from low resolutions, at least for these previous generations, didn't work terribly well. But then once you get to the super high end, well, it's nice to have, you're not relying on it as heavily, though you are if you use stuff like path tracing. So anyway, 20% is the figure we landed on. You and I both thought that 20% would be a big enough discount to justify buying Radeon. And personally, for a lot of the matchups, I would have taken the Radeon GPU over the GeForce GPU for a 20% saving. So that's our opinion, at least for the previous generation matchups. Unfortunately, as is we hear all the time, Tim, that YouTubers are disconnected from reality and gamers. And hey, it turns out that was true, just in the different direction that insult is normally hurled at us. So it's not a big enough discount. Basically, we were 30% seems to be, and it was interesting. The other day, I was talking with a retailer, and we were discussing the 9070 XT pricing, and I said, look, I think for these things to sell well and continue to sell well and this be a successful generation, it's going to need to equate to $550 US, which is a 30% discount. And they're like, that's brutal. Like, that's a big discount. I'm like, yeah, but I think that's what Radeon needs to sell. And we sort of had a bit of back and forth on that. Anyway, he went away. He obviously went and had a look at some sales data over the last few years. And he said, wow, I found something interesting. When we first brought the 7900 XTX in, it didn't sell very well. The GeForce GPU sold, so the RTX 4080 sold quite well initially, started to cool off. But the 1700 XTX just never got going. Like, it didn't sell well initially. It didn't move. We were basically unable to move them. So, okay. And then they said, but we got some deals coming through because we had to move the inventory, and we got to a position where we could sell a 7900 XTX for 30% less than an RTX 4080. Once we were able to offer that discount and those deals, they started moving, like selling like hotcakes. We were able to clear out the inventory of cards we had. And that really only slowed right down to a crawl and basically stopped again once the 4080 Super came out, dropped it by $200 US, closed the margin back up, and that Radeon was no longer able to offer anywhere near a 30% discount. And, therefore, basically they stopped selling. So he's like, yeah, I hadn't really realized it, but essentially what you're saying is, when they achieve a 30% discount, they sell really well. 20% discount, they sell, but not super well. And anything less than that, they just sit there and don't move at all. So that was some sort of concrete evidence to confirm our updated thoughts on pricing. So,
and that's right. To be clear, I think we don't just come up with these numbers out of thin air. It's not like we're going, 20% would be okay. And then we're like, oh, no, we're just going to change our mind on a whim. 30% is okay now. Mm-hmm. This is very much based on, discussions and closely looking at market share, where market share is trending, which cards are selling well versus other cards. And we try and get as much information about all these things throughout the year. And so, I think what was really eye-opening was some of the discussions we were having at Computex about GeForce versus Radeon market share. Mm-hmm. I was under the impression that Radeon market share globally was a little better than what we actually had been told by various people at Computex. And so we were sort of looking at the trends over time and saying, well, they've done all this 20% stuff with at least some of the models. Like maybe the market share would be different if every model was hitting that price, which wasn't the case.
And
like
from
7600
launch.
At launch, maybe if that was 20% better at launch, okay. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like what people were saying who were dealing with selling these models was that even the good examples, like a 7800 XT versus 4070, that discount, it was selling better than the crap models from AMD, but not drastically well, like not selling out immediately. And I think if you look at things like the Steam survey and stuff over time, which is not the greatest source of information, but the most popular Radeon card for a long time has been the RX 6600, which has been available for around $180 to $200 US. Don't know what's going to happen this generation, but that's what it used to be. And if you think of the nearest competitor to that card from NVIDIA was the terrible RTX 3050, which still outsold the 6600. Let's be clear. The 3050 still outsold that card.
Crazy.
The 6600 was at least 30 or 40% better value cost per frame in a lot of your testing at the real world prices that those cards were available for. I think that says a lot. Like it's just adding more to the pile of the information that we've got in terms of how low these prices need to go. So what we're looking at with the 9070 XT, and we'll talk about the 9070, which is very weirdly priced. Mm-hmm. The 9070 XT looks to be, based on what AMD are claiming, about 20% better value than a 5070 Ti for raster performance. And then for ray tracing performance, it's here or there. It might be similar value. It might be a little worse value, a little better value. Depends on how that comes out in the testing,
Mhm.
because obviously the games we use and you use for testing is a little different to what AMD shows. You do a bit more path tracing testing with like Alan Wake. AMD is a bit more on the lighter end of the scale. So we'll see how all that plays out. But that's kind of where the value's sitting. So they're sort of doing the value that they've offered previously, but are now going, maybe our features are better.
Yeah. Well, just to conclude, because I derailed myself a little bit, the $550 price that I was saying they need to do is not what they need to do to get a positive review from me. It's just what I think they need to do to revive the Radeon brand. So, like, when are they going to start doing that? Because they didn't achieve it with the 7000 series. So, with this new 9000 series, when's the
rebuild?
The
7800 XT, that got a good review from you at that price. The 20% discount got a reasonable review.
Yeah, there was some decent value options in there, and they got positive reviews. And like the 7700 XT became a key recommendation from us, not at launch, but it got to a good point. And so did the 7900 XT. I even re-reviewed the 7900 XT. I think it was a year after release. It got a dedicated re-review from us. I can't remember exactly what was said in that, but I did a re-review. But the $550 price that I was suggesting for the 9070 XT was the price AMD need to set to start making some inroads and rebuilding the brand. That was my opinion. Now, for a mostly positive review, that can probably be achieved with the $600 price they have announced. Of course, I've still got a lot of ray tracing stuff I have to work out. You know, you've got some upscaling stuff you want to look into, so it's difficult.
Yeah, we have to actually confirm that what AMD said for raster is true as well.
Yep, so there's things we have to confirm there, but it's looking like $600 it's both sort of it's the highest price I think they can charge for it to be. So I don't know. Again, there's a lot of things to work out. I think it's going to be anywhere from like lukewarm to positive reception for reviews. And then when it comes to gamers and consumers, I don't know. I'm not sure. Of course, there's other factors at play as well. I think initially people are going, if it does hit shelves at $600 US, like the base models, and there's good availability, I think people are going to be wrapped because the alternative's not good. But then if NVIDIA turn around and they're like, oh, this is what a coincidence this is. We now have 5070 Ti's coming out our backside, and if you want one for 750, not a problem. I don't know. Yeah. Whatever the problem was previously, we've managed to solve it, guys. And they'll spin it with they'll be like the heroes of the situation. Like, we've been working tirelessly. The demand has just been so extreme, and it's taken us by surprise. But we're NVIDIA. We've got hard at work, and we've got them out there. We've solved the problem, so we should be able to meet the demand now. And, it'd be some PR spiel like that, and that's how they will have instantly managed to turn the tap on, and they'll be $750, and it's still $150 discount. So it's a 20% discount, not necessarily cost per frame, but just on the retail price.
Yeah. So 25% more to get the 5070 Ti is another way of thinking of it.
Sure. Yep. At the end of the day, you're saving $150 US, which is a substantial amount of money at that price point. So I still think that makes the 9070 XT attractive. Now, if it was $650, which I believe that was what they were really targeting as sort of their minimum, $100, it's just a repeat of the last generation, isn't it? People just don't buy it. You're not giving up dealer. You're not giving up potentially, well, probably a superior upscaling technology and almost certainly superior ray tracing performance for $100 saving. And I mean, I don't really even care that much for ray tracing still at this point in time. I know it's something you really like, and you're delving more and more in it, which makes sense. I'm not necessarily pushing the ray tracing angle heavily myself, but it's $100. Like, if you're getting a
it's
number
$100
of things
in a $700 price range.
Yeah, if you're getting a number of things that are superior, like they are superior, then it's like, I'll just spend the extra $100 and get the better brand. And people say drivers are better, and people hear all of these things. It's not necessarily me saying this, but that's what drives people to just go for the better thing so.
And that's exactly what Radeon has done. Like, I know there's these jokes of it's NVIDIA minus $50, but the reality is it's actually been NVIDIA minus $100. Like the
Some have been
7800
50.
XT has been minus $100. The 7900 XT, when they started selling it for $700, was minus $100 on the 4070 Ti Super price.
Mm-hmm.
So that was minus 100. And now they've basically gone, what about minus 150? So it's better. It's like the dollar amount is better, but whether or not that's enough. And I think that you've brought up a really good point. I think that the initial sales of this card for the first couple of weeks, month, is going to be pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would have been good at $650, maybe even $700, just because of how expensive the 5070 Ti is in the real world right now.
Mm-hmm.
But my concern, I think what we were basing a lot of our discussion last week on, is that the GPU market is not just 1 month. These cards are likely going to have to be on sale for 18 to 24 months because the GPU cycle these days is about 2 years. Maybe there'll be some refreshes and new models and potential price cuts. It's all possible. But after initial demand clears up, it's common for prices to be inflated for a little bit after launches. So who knows? Maybe the $900 price will be forever. Maybe it'll just be around for a month. We have no idea. But if that clears up and prices settle, and it turns out that the value difference between the two cards at MSRP is not that good, like it's okay, but it's not that good, what happens when you can walk into a Best Buy or a Micro Center in the US or a PC Case Gear here and just buy either model at the MSRP off the shelves?
Mm-hmm.
Like what are people going to buy then? And I think the market has shown with the previous generation that number was not 20%, it was more. And so AMD's basically gone, well, guys, we're doing the 20% thing again. Hopefully, initially, we'll get even more sales because of the current situation, but then after that, we'll rely on better ray tracing numbers, FSR4, to mean that 20% is now better than it was in the previous gen. And that's, I'm not saying that's unfair. The 20% was based on their feature deficit. So if they narrow the feature deficit, the 20% becomes better. But I think a lot of things that we were saying is that if this was like RDNA 3 all over again, no feature improvement, the deficit's still the same, then 20% was not even going to come close to cutting it. It would have had to have been 30, maybe even 40% to justify buying the Radeon card. And so there's a lot of things to weigh up there. Like, I feel like when we were saying the $550 price, that was pretty much like, that's probably going to take care of a lot of these discussions. It's going to mean raster value's better, ray tracing value's better, DLSS is minimized as sort of this thing that you want to spend more money on because the difference is so large in price. All the other features, it's all taken account in that price. Whereas I feel like $600 is kind of, it makes it hard to weigh up those things.
Yeah, there's a few scenarios in which this can play out. One scenario is they launch it for $600, which they're going to, and it sells really well. And it continues to sell really well.
Mm-hmm.
NVIDIA aren't going to stand by and watch that happen, you wouldn't think. And that's where the $750 price will be honored. And then, now you have the choice, a choice of legitimately buying a 5070 Ti for $750 or a 9070 XT for $600. And that's where, what we've been talking about. People now start going, oh, do I buy the Radeon GPU or do I spend a bit more money and get the NVIDIA GPU? And then there's that toss-up, and we know which way people typically tend to go. So therefore, the sales of the Radeon GPUs will start to slow down quite rapidly based on information we've heard from retailers, based on historic data. So to expect anything different there would be unwise. And then they're in a position which could take part in 1 month from now, 2 months from now, likely within 6 months from now, where they have to discount the price. And are we going to see, so we know we're going to see it for $600. Are we going to see a 9070 XT within the next 6 months for $550?
I think there's a very strong chance of that, especially if 5070 prices recover, as you say. I think as we talked about in the previous podcast, if that happens, they should officially cut the price, not this. We're
Well,
going to do some discounts and say it's $50 cheaper. I mean, come out and say, "Hey
this,
guys,
yeah,
we've sold it for 600, and now it's 550."
they're scared of doing that though, because when's the next cryptocurrency boom happening? You know, going back up in price officially is tough. So I think they like to keep that stuff dynamic. And that's another thing we can talk about NVIDIA cutting prices, which that comes into it and why they would be hesitant to do that. Now, I'm going to propose a scenario that I absolutely, just to be clear, is anti-consumer and I don't want to see happen. But do AMD need to start playing this dirty game? Because NVIDIA launches cards, and if there's no competition or no real reason to price it at the MSRP, they clearly don't. So would it have been a smarter play? And again, I almost shudder saying this out loud, but got to explore all avenues.
We're putting our business hats on. This is not the consumer review hardware unbox that you know. We're talking about let's make money for the company dirty, putting on that business hat hardware unbox.
It's playing the same. You can't have your competition playing a dirty, and then you anyway. Don't really want to go down this path, but we sort of have to. What would have stopped AMD from saying, you know what, guys, we're going to do $550 US. We're doing that. And it's $200 cheaper than our competition's part, offering way more value. And they do an NVIDIA. They launch it. There's a couple of base models that you can buy for $550 and the rest are $650, which is more than what they're, charging, what they're claiming to be charging. And then they do that, and then if NVIDIA starts to lower prices, then they like NVIDIA heads towards 750, then they can head towards 550, and they can do that without an official price cut. Now, people are saying if AMD did launch at 550 and sold at 550, and cut right into their margins, which hurts research and development and all that sort of budgeting, then NVIDIA would just lower their price and maintain whatever margin they feel is acceptable, like a 15% premium or 20% premium or whatever. But for NVIDIA to do that, they then actually have to officially, they don't have to officially lower the MSRP, but they have to start selling below MSRP. And I just can't
usually do that.
I can't see them doing that.
That's why I know people say the whole price war thing, like AMD doesn't want to get into a price war because NVIDIA will keep pricing theirs lower and lower and eat margins. It's like, well, when was the last time NVIDIA cut the price of a GPU when they weren't introducing a new model that was similar? And I can't think of the last time they did that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I want the MSRP to be a real thing, and I want these companies to be honest and not anti-consumer, but you can't have one company, like it's supposed to be a duopoly. We can't have one company continually failing each generation and their market share shrinking. So they've got to play the game. First of all, they've legitimately got to offer much better value. They've legitimately got to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But they've also got to create a lot of hype and excitement around their brand. And 550 would do that. It would do that. Whereas I think the reviews are going to be more towards lukewarm than they are like, this is insane, this is awesome. And I know you don't want a situation, like I know how painful this sounds, you don't want a situation where the reviews are then misleading as well, because we're given, a misleading price. But at the same time, if it does end up being 550 basically permanently within, 3 months from now, I just think, God, that should have been the launch price.
Yeah, if they're forced to discount it anyway, if they're then just make that the launch price.
Yeah. So again, this hasn't happened yet. We have to wait and see what happens. I'm just expecting it based on what I know these cards will sell at, because that's determined by the market, not me, and what's happened historically. So yeah, if we see a situation where the 9070 XT is at or about $550 in 3 to 6 months from now, you just think, is the strategy working? Was that the way to go about this? Or should we have just said 550, sold a percentage of the cards at that price and, ate those margins now, sold some other ones at higher margins, and then eventually got down to the price once,
Yeah.
FOMO wears off.
So I think there's a few reasons why AMD kind of can't do what you've been saying. And I think it's not from a ethical perspective if they want to be, the good company that doesn't do dodgy stuff. I think NVIDIA's got a lot more pull when it comes to AIBs. So, allocation of GPU samples is something that NVIDIA has historically had a lot of say over,
Mhm.
whereas AMD, being in the lesser position than NVIDIA for GPUs, I don't think they'll be wanting to anger their AIBs too much by trying to force, for example, a $550 US MSRP up to $650. Whereas I think NVIDIA, via allocations and those sort of things, could more easily achieve that. I think that's just because of the position they're in with AIBs and that sort of thing. They've lost MSIs in AIB, so you
Mhm.
wouldn't want to be screwing around AIBs too much. And yeah, maybe AIBs benefit from selling cards for $650. But yeah, I just don't think they'll have the pool to do that. And secondly, AMD, the reason why I've been told from AIBs that AMD likes to do the current system of pricing it where they price it, then lowering the price over time, is that they deal those price discounts directly to retailers through systems like, for example, saying, here's your allocation of, let's say, 7900 XTXs. If you can sell out all your 7900 XTXs, we'll give you a rebate that makes that price effectively, let's say, $900 instead of $1,000. So this is encouraging retailers to promote the product effectively by saying, we're offering $100 off, because it is encouraging them to sell all the cards because they don't get the discount unless they sell a certain quota. And then AMD gets the benefits of, I guess, not really having to advertise because that's all done by a third party. And AIB's benefit because they still get the full MSRP price from AMD. So the AIB still buys the card for $1,000 from AMD, and then they sell the card for $1,000 to the retailer, and the retailer does all the discounts and promotions and stuff. At least that's my understanding of the majority of how those discounts occur. There have been AIB to AMD discounts directly as well, but the majority of it happens that way. So I think AMD likes that system because they just don't get as much marketing as NVIDIA. NVIDIA is dominant when it comes to marketing. So I think they try do that. They're kind of sacrificing the reviews a little bit. So they've got this marketing thing they can do later with retailers.
Yeah, what is the best form of marketing, though, in 2025, the modern age? Like, I feel like, especially in the current climate, I think this is why so many people were excited about it and angling for it, even though they knew it wasn't going to be a reality. $550. The marketing takes care of itself when you've got every single tech reviewer on planet Earth raving about the value of this product and using it. Because if it's $550 and the 5070 Ti even manages to get to $750, how can you recommend that in a build guide? It's very, very difficult to recommend the GeForce GPU.
Yeah, unless the 9070 XT is worse than what AMD has shown. But yeah, like if we take their claims at face value, what they've shown, then yeah, very difficult.
Even if it's a 7900 XT.
Yeah, difficult, reasonably difficult.
It's really, really hard to recommend the GeForce GPU beyond very specific use cases. For general gaming, the $200 cheaper Radeon GPU will get pretty much the tick of approval from everyone. So that's pretty big marketing.
Yeah, and I think the other issue that AMD has is that if they keep discounting cards, like starting at a higher price of 600, then dropping it to 550, gamers will just wait for the discount because they'll know AMD is always the company that does the discount. So why buy the card at $600 when I can just wait 3 months and buy for $550? Which is why I think NVIDIA doesn't do as much discounting. They keep the prices as they are, and instead of discounting, they just launch a new model. And I think that would be a much better way of AMD going about if they were going to drop the price to $550, is don't discount the price. Release a 9070 something else, a refreshed version that's a little better in some ways or whatever, and adjust the price on that model, because that's exactly what NVIDIA does. So if you're talking about playing the NVIDIA game, yeah, they can do the dirty stuff, but if they want to play it in a more honest way, then keeping the price, being confident in the price, saying, we believe $600 is a really great price and try and capitalize on that now. But then if that doesn't work out, refresh the model. Make the how they did the 6650 XTs and stuff, which back then were more of kind of a very mediocre value increase. But if they made that more of like a 4080 Super versus 4080 situation where they just fully price correct it, like you make it 3% faster, but you drop the price by $50 or whatever, then you get reviewers talking about the products again, because people don't re-review unofficial price cuts. You did it for one product, but generally that doesn't happen. If you do a new product, people start reviewing it. There's more hype about it. People are interested. Oh, the refresh. And yeah, the refreshes never get as many sales and as interest as the initial model. But what gets even less interest is just a price cut. And what gets even less interest than that is an unofficial price cut that's kind of just hidden until you look at a retailer's store. So if they're playing the NVIDIA game is keeping the confident in the price, making the price a good price to begin with. Not that's necessarily the NVIDIA game. They don't always do that, but you know what I mean. Make the price good, confident, and then if it needs adjusting later, make a new model. That's what I would do instead of just making this card $550 in 3 months like we're expecting. Wait a little bit longer, refresh it if needed. But I think at least initially they'll get at least a few months worth of reasonable reception out of it. Whether, again, I think $550 people would be queuing up at stores, that sort of thing. So
yeah, so that takes care of the marketing, doesn't it? Well,
yeah.
As an example for you to sort of counter the point you had about that, if you take apart like the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D and the Core i9 12900K, which part do you expect had the bigger advertising budget? Which one was advertised more to the general public?
Probably the Intel CPU.
I would have thought the Intel CPU comfortably. You couldn't find at any point the 1200K on Amazon's top CPU sale list. The 5800X 3D was like number one often. And it was a pretty expensive CPU upon launch.
Because it was the better part.
What was the better part? It was better value, it was better performance, and it was cheaper, better value for gaming, of course, we're talking about, which is what most people who are do-it-yourself sort of retail market, they're mostly interested in gaming performance. At least that's what the CPU charts have suggested. I mean, yeah, that took care of itself, didn't it? I just think a $550 9070 XT takes care of everything.
Yeah, there's a bit more of a fight they have to do now. There's a bit more convincing. The higher that you go with each of these parts, the more convincing is required at each step. AMD needs to be ticking off as many comparisons as possible. And this is one of the things that when AMD asks for feedback from us and potentially other reviewers, this is one of the things that I was suggesting to them, was that the more things that you tick off that are going to be comparisons consumers make, the more sales you get, basically. So, for example, if you tick off raster performance value, then you're going to get the crowd that's only interested in raster performance. But if you can tick off that and ray tracing value, then you start being, you accumulate another crowd of people. Then you tick off VRAM. So anyone concerned about VRAM also is interested. Then you tick off upscaling, and you start ticking off each of these things so that any comparison that you could make to your competitor's product is always favorable in some way. Then you're going to have a really strong product that everyone's going to buy. But the higher that you start pricing the products, the less of those things are ever going to be ticked off. So if it was $650, very few of those things would have been ticked off. $600, maybe a few more, but not necessarily all of them. I think the point that we were making in the podcast and then basically just copied that to AMD was at $550, we think that the majority of those comparisons and things that need to be ticked off would be ticked off. And that would make it a broadly popular product. That's again, assuming that everything AMD is advertised to this point about the product is accurate. And to be clear, we recorded that podcast before we were briefed on the product, basically. And we weren't told the price ahead of time or anything. So we were just going off the performance. But yeah, so we were just, as we said, I think we assumed it was XTX level performance.
Yeah, we made it clear we were speculating and making assumptions.
Yeah. So anyway, those are just my thoughts.
And they turned out to be, well, so far looking pretty accurate. And yeah, I mean, the biggest counter I've seen to the $550 price tag is just that AMD will be cutting too much into their margins and NVIDIA will just lower their price, and then they don't get the benefit of, a much cheaper product that's going to sell in higher volumes. But if they released it at $550 Do you think we would see a $700 5070 Ti?
No, no,
Well, of course,
categorically no.
yeah, of
They
course we
they
wouldn't.
would wait a year and make a supermodel at best.
Yep.
They just aimed Nvidia. Like I said, I cannot remember the last time
They're not a
that they
discount brand.
lowered the price of a model without a new model coming in.
And again, that's what luxury brands do. They would rather throw their product in the trash than sell it with a discount tag on it.
Mm-hmm. Which is basically what they did with the 4080. That model, they never really discounted it. They just released the new model. Even if when it wasn't selling, they were never like, let's make this $1,000. They were like, okay, well, let's just not make any more of them. Hopefully those cards will sell out over time. And then we'll just introduce the supermodel and then hope for the best.
They've learnt from that, and that's why they've launched things the way they have. So the way we can prove that we're absolutely right here is that if in the next 3 to 6 months it does drop down to $550 and Nvidia does nothing with the 5070 Ti pricing, it's $750 or higher, then there's your answer. But we'll see how all that plays out. I'm intrigued.
It's very intriguing because there's a lot of things going on with supply. Obviously, it's not just the fact that NVIDIA GPUs are very overpriced right now. It's that just generally you cannot buy a GPU. Like they're just, a lot of them are discontinued now because they were all, I guess, aiming for that January launch window. It's now nearly March, so a lot of issues there. But do you want to talk briefly before we get into the 9070? I think it's probably important just to give some context around, the conversations with AMD that we had, because it's a little unusual for AMD to approach us, and I assume other reviewers, at least based on the Gamers Nexus video, it sounded like that was going on. A little unusual to be approached with those sorts of questions ahead of a release. But to be clear, this wasn't a situation where we were told a price, we thought it was bad, and then started tweeting about it and making comments and claims. We were not told the price. So everything that we were saying in the podcast and in tweets and whatever was based on our assumption of what the performance would be and coming up with a price that we felt was reasonable. And when AMD was asking us questions along those lines, that was the things that we were feeding back to them. Usually companies ask those sorts of questions after they tell you all the information. So they'll say, here's what we're doing. What are your thoughts? But this time around, a little differently. And just some interesting things. And this isn't unusual for companies. It's not like AMD is the only brand to say, what do you think of this product? At CES, when having face-to-face chats with NVIDIA, for example, going and seeing their products, they ask you a lot of stuff. Like I was looking at DLSS 4, they're like, what do you think? What are you seeing? Looking at Reflex 2, what are you seeing? What did you think of the announcement yesterday? All those sorts of questions. So it's not like this is AMD reaching out. We're only answering questions for AMD. Every company does this. Intel does it through the review process. People often ask for feedback. It happens for monitors. It happens for motherboards. It happens for everything. So not some sort of clandestine secret operation going on. It's just chats with companies is very, very common.
Yep. Generally, they're more concerned about stuff like the performance we're seeing, or, are there any stability issues or anything like that, any actual issues that they could get ahead of before the review goes out. Pricing typically is something we'll get late in, well, it depends on the company. Sometimes pricing is announced well ahead of time. We just know what the pricing is. We're just going to work out the performance. Other times, say the Radeon RX 7600, we didn't know pricing till I think it was a couple of days before reviews were set to go live, which was really frustrating.
There's been some GeForce reviews in the past. I remember when you were working at TechSpot where they gave the price like less than 24 hours ahead of time.
Yep. NVIDIA's done that in the past as well. And I give the 7600, the RX 7600 as an example because AMD told us, all right, guys, we're launching this at $300. And I just replied to them saying, well, that's a crap price. Like, you're not getting a positive review. It's going to be a very negative review. You've just matched, NVIDIA's price. I don't really get the point of the product. Like, what's the angle here? How are we recommending this to our audience? It just and then they said, basically, they got that feedback from all reviewers, evidently, and then they knocked $30 off. I was telling them $250 would have been the price that they sell really well at, and that's what they should go with. And they knocked $30 off, so which resulted in not disastrous reviews. I think overall, lukewarm reviews. My recollection is that the RX 7600 was met with lukewarm reviews.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of what my expectation is going to be for the 9070 XT. Maybe slightly
It's not going to
better.
be as bad. I'd say you're being a bit generous with lukewarm on the 7600. There was certainly reviews that were very upset, more than you, about the last minute price cut, which kind of soured it. And then your review wasn't that positive. You were like,
okay,
at $270, you were basically like, I'm not sure about this. I think you said like just buy a 6600 XT or whatever the equivalent was at the time. Whereas with the 9070 XT, it's not like there is even a product to say, just go buy X product instead of this.
Yeah,
so I think it'll be a bit different.
Yeah, I think it'll be okay. So 7600 was negative to lukewarm, whereas I think the 9070 XT will be lukewarm to positive.
Yeah.
So, yeah, whatever.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting when we put up the poll, obviously, on the Hardware Unbox channel, asking about pricing and seeing, obviously $650 confirmed dead based on that poll.
Mm-hmm.
But the relatively even spread between the remaining price points was kind of interesting. I'm not sure how much interest they've left on the table by not doing a lower price point based on that poll. Obviously, the poll is going to be influenced by our own opinions. Let's be very clear. We're well aware that when we do a poll on the Hardware Unbox channel, that it's going to be our audience of people responding, people that listen to our opinions, is going to be influenced in some way by the things that we say, as opposed to channels that maybe have never discussed pricing before. But based on that poll, there is certainly interest or claimed interest in that product at prices below that. But I think the just general feedback, listening to things on X and other places about the price, and obviously after the announcement, the feedback hasn't been awful for the $600 price. Like, it's not like people have gone out and been like dead, awful, terrible price. They've been like, okay, it's reasonable. AMD hasn't fumbled over themselves and gone with some of the rumored $700, $650 prices.
It's hard to gauge that ahead of time, though, because a lot of people are expecting it to be as fast as like an RTX 4080, which is not what AMD has indicated.
Yeah, the ray tracing rumors was going to be an RTX 4080 in ray tracing. I mean, that would have been like a mind-blowing architectural gain. I don't really know where that came from.
Yeah.
It just hasn't happened.
Yeah, the community feedback and general sentiment there is difficult to gauge until we have all of the reviews online, so they can go watch, all their favorite reviewers and see what they had to say, and then work out where the dust settles there. Mm-hmm. And also just not even necessarily care about our opinion, just see the performance numbers for themselves and draw their own conclusions and opinions based on the performance data. But I mean, the poll for me, the takeaway was people obviously hate 650 US. I mean, it's going to be difficult to get people to vote on the highest price anyway. And then that's going to skew people towards voting for the lowest price, which is $500 US. But if you say a lot of people voted for the lowest price just because it was the lowest price, you could bump them up a tier to say $550 US. Like, they'd still accept that. I think the people that voted $500 US would be wrapped with $550 US and accept that. But probably not super wrapped with $600 US. Mm-hmm. And what that means is the majority of the people who would be interested in buying a 9070 XT would be wanting to do so for less than $600 US.
Yes, that's certainly the takeaway. I mean, who knows how much the marketing of the card and stuff will be able to influence people up to $600, after they've seen that sort of thing. I mean, again, I think the reception has been, reasonable for the price. I wouldn't say like everyone's on board, like everyone's going, amazing sort of price. But I think the thing that's helped them a lot into convincing people that $600 is not too bad is the rumors that it was going to be like $750 or $650 or whatever. And so people are seeing the lower price and going, well, it's not as bad as I was expecting. I don't know whether that's good enough, but at least it's not as bad as it could have been, which is, I guess, kind of a lot of the theme of this podcast, right? Like
Mhm.
the price isn't amazing. Like I'm not blown away. I'm not wowed majorly by the price, but when we finished the briefing from AMD, when they did not tell us the price, there was a lot of very concerning slides in there where they were comparing the 9070 XT to like $1,000 GPUs. There was a slide where they had sort of, I think they said like, our goal is GPUs below $700. And there was another slide where they sort of put it between the 7900 XT and 7900 GRE. And we were sitting there watching this
Yeah,
and
I
just
was
chatting.
thinking,
And we were like, oh my, this is going to be, the price of this is going to be absolutely dreadful.
I was expecting like 670, 680, and I was like, this is gonna be so bad. They've been
Yep.
debated essentially into thinking that the 5070 Ti will always be $900 or $1,000.
Yeah.
So I really think the initial plans probably were between $650 and $700, and therefore I am pleasantly surprised we got a $600 US price. And look, again, for those who think we're being overly negative, they're listeners thinking, you guys crazy, look how expensive GPUs are. $600 US is amazing. I agree. I think if you were holding out to buy a new GPU and you wanted one and you wanted something that was around, that sort of, what would you call it? Mid-high performance, then being able to get a 9070 XT, if you can indeed get one for $600 US, then that's great. I just don't know how great that's going to be in a couple of months from now when all of this initial release cycle stuff wears off and availability of GeForce GPUs improves to the point where they're actually available and MSRPs are met.
And yeah, I mean, let's talk about the 9070 at $550. I mean, I think this card is almost dead on arrival. I think the price makes absolutely no sense.
Mhm.
AMD's own performance numbers suggest that the 9070 XT is 42% faster than the 7900 GRE. The 9070 is 21% faster than the GRE at 4K. Now, if you compare those two, that would suggest that the 9070 is 15% slower, but it's only 8% cheaper. So that just doesn't make any sense. Even based on AMD's own numbers, why would you price it like that?
Yeah, it's 8% cheaper. It's got 13% fewer cores, and the cores are clocked 14% lower, and then you just have the same memory subsystems, the same ROPs. And
yeah, it's not even the specs though. It's like they could have looked at the specs, but also they had their own performance slides saying that the actual real world performance, according to them, was more than an 8% loss of performance. So that's just a 7700 XT again.
Yeah, it needs to be $500, obviously.
Yeah, like that card's going to be $500. Pretty quick, smart. And I mean, we've been told by retailers that it's always the higher model that gets much more attention than the lower model. So they were already up against it trying to sell a lower card because most people buy the XT or whatever, or previously, the XTX over the XT. But yeah, this price, I mean, it's just not good.
Yeah, you're not saving $50 to get that. It just doesn't make any sense. So $100 is what you would save to not get the best Radeon GPU. Yeah, that one is pretty simple. Weird choice, but we've seen them do those sort of strange releases before with the XTX and the XT at the 7900 series, as you said, and then it was the 7800 XT, wasn't it? And then the 7700 XT had less memory and was like, again, was it $50 less?
Yep.
It was $500 to $450, wasn't it? I think that's right. Yeah. So it's a repeat of that. And then, before you knew it, they had to drop that thing down to 400 and then eventually, it became a really good value part. So again, the 9070 is definitely it is going to be reviewed in a negative light. Now, Gamers Nexus, Harbor Unboxed, we typically do individual reviews. So we'll have an individual 9070 review that'll probably follow the XT review by, it'll be the next night. And if that's a highly negative review, it's like that's sort of the last impression of the 9070 series that people are left with as well. Like the thumbnail is going to be something like pointless or dead on arrival because it is. And yeah, you get this negative connotation around the 9070 series because of that, which doesn't help the brand at all. Doesn't help improve their mind share, brand presence, all that sort of stuff. and then they'll discount it to $500, which is what we said it should have been relative to the 9070 XT.
Mhm.
And they'll probably discount the 9070 XT, and then the 9070 will be discounted again, and they'll be even better value. And then you get 3 to 6 months out, and they're both fantastic value. It's like,
Yeah. I think the 9070 series looks to be, challenging the 5070 Ti quite well in some respects. Maybe not as good as they could have, as we've talked about, but there's some challenge there. I think up against the 5070, though, I just don't think they've done enough to compete against that product. I mean, the obvious thing that is in favor of the AMD card is that at the same price, you get 16 gig of VRAM instead of 12 gig. So obviously the 5070, which reviews haven't come out for that product yet either, there is going to be some part of your review that is negative because of the 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which there won't be for the 9070. So that's a factor that's going for it. But based on their performance claims, it's not looking like it's going to be that much faster than a 5070. So as you said, I believe the 5070 will be around 4070 super levels of performance based on its configuration and what we've seen with 5070 Ti for the hardware specs and everything. And so, the 9070, it might be 10 to 15% faster in a good scenario. It's probably going to be slower for ray tracing. Whether or not that is hugely influential on this price, I'm not sure, but we're still talking about a $550 GPU. So in my opinion, you'd probably want some level of ray tracing capabilities. So the fact that they're going for the same price, it's going to be a little faster for raster, a little slower for ray tracing, probably with more VRAM. That seems less compelling to me than the 7800 XT versus 4070 was previously, where it was $100 cheaper, a little bit faster, and for raster, it was slower for ray tracing, and it had more VRAM.
You've also got the problem where the 5070 may be poorly received because it's a very expensive GPU to only have 12 gigabytes of VRAM. And you can't even play like Indiana Jones. You can't play it with path tracing beyond, I think, 1080p with upscaling.
On a 12 gig GPU.
On a 12 gig GPU.
Yeah.
So if you've already got one of the best examples of ray tracing, I'm right in saying that, aren't I? Like that game's transformative with path tracing. It's one of the best showcases we have to date. How long are you keeping this GPU for? 2, 3, 4 years? If one of the best examples we have and one of the best reasons, the best showcases to go and purchase a GeForce GPU, you can't actually run at all.
I mean, that is one game, but I get what you're saying. It's going to be more of those examples over time.
Whenever we've had an example of something, whether it be like a CPU with a certain amount of resources, and there's games that cripple it, it's like, it can in one light be seen as good value, but then the writing's already on the wall. This thing's probably going to be near useless in 2 years from now. Is that a good investment, or should you spend 20% more to get something that is probably going to work for the foreseeable? And we had the same discussion when reviewing the RTX 3070 and RX 6800. You spend a little bit more on the RX 6800. Ray tracing performance, not as good. DLSS, FSR in that case, the upscaling technology, not quite as good. But we see the RX 6800 having much more legs in it. So the ray tracing performance becomes irrelevant, and that's probably what we're going to see with the RTX 5070, because it doesn't have enough VRAM. And that situation is, what would you rather have in your system right now if you could pick an RX 6800 or an RTX 3070?
I mean, yes, you'd prefer a 6800. I think this generation is going to be a very interesting battle. I think it's a bit more complex than you've made it out to be, because with that example of like a 3070 versus 6800, on the 6800, you've always had the option of just turning off ray tracing. So obviously you can't turn on ray tracing on a 3070, and because of its lack of VRAM, you just wouldn't on a 6800 because it's too slow. So then you just fall back to what's the general raster performance of the card, which is obviously in favor of the AMD model. It can run games with 12 gigabytes of VRAM easily, which the 3070 can't, so it's the better product. What these cards are going to run into is a little different, in that there will be games that only let you use ray tracing. And so I imagine for those really high-end experiences with path tracing, that the 5070 is going to be basically useless. And I imagine the 9070 is going to be basically useless as well because it won't be fast enough. And maybe in some edge cases, you'll see the 16 gig card do a little better. But what about the games like Indiana Jones without path tracing on, Star Wars Outlaws, the upcoming Assassin's Creed, the upcoming Doom game where they're ray tracing only? The fallback in that scenario is still ray tracing. So if the 9070 is, there's some configuration it can run with enough, because they're not going to be able to make like an Assassin's Creed game that is ray tracing only and uses more than 12 gig of VRAM, because that will eliminate the vast majority of players.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just not going to do that. There's going to be some settings that work on 8 gig card. So the question is going to be very much, I think this will be really interesting because I don't know which way it'll go, is what can the 5070 do in a ray tracing only game? Like, are we talking medium settings with faster ray tracing performance? Or is the 9070 going to enable you to do, let's say, a higher texture quality level, but it's not as fast in general for the ray tracing part? So you're going to have this weird balance where, let's say you're using medium settings in a Star Wars Outlaws, for example. Is the 5070 going to be faster, but you have to turn down ray tracing, versus the 9070 we have to use a lower preset, but you can run high textures? That's going to be how those cards age over time as we see more ray tracing games is going to be really interesting.
I didn't even really necessarily mean it like that. It's more where what we've been talking about this entire podcast, you justify paying a premium for the better brand because the better brand is better.
Mm-hmm.
But if the better brand's not better, then what are you paying the premium for? Or, in this case, similar money. So
I guess what I'm suggesting is that potentially the 5070 will still be better than a 9070 for ray tracing in some examples. The games where ray tracing is forced on and there is some sort of low to medium setting that you'll be able to use.
Yeah, well, we can't confirm that yet. I'm not sure.
It's going to be really, it's going to be really interesting because I think both cards are going to have their drawbacks. The 5070, there will be games where the higher quality ray tracing experiences, so ray tracing is forced in the game and you're wanting to run it at higher ultra, just not enough VRAM. Then there's going to be the 9070 where the higher ultra, enough VRAM, not fast enough, potentially, depending if the performance is where I think it's going to be.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to get to is a bit lost. Circling back to the start of the conversation, I'm not advocating for the 9070 at all. I'm actually saying that the value proposition's probably not good at all because the RTX 5070 I don't think is good at all. So whether or it's back to our turd sandwich analogy. Whether or not it's better, it has to be it has to be a lot better. The 9070 has to be a lot better value than the RTX 5070.
Yep.
And it was the same problem we had previously with the RTX 4080. The RTX 4080, we were like, value's not great in our opinion, not particularly impressive. So although AMD had dropped the price by $200 and wasn't quite as good in many respects, it's like, well, we weren't wrapped with that, and then this isn't as good, but it's cheaper. So
yeah, you're saying that relative to a bad product, you have to do more to impress.
Well, yeah,
because otherwise you're just making a bad, slightly better bad as opposed to good, which is two different things.
So I didn't mean to get too hung up on the VRAM, but essentially I'm saying the 5070 is bad because of the price and the amount of VRAM you're getting as one factor. Like that's
this isn't NDA breaking stuff, guys. Like, it has 12 gig of VRAM. It's $550. That's what it is. We know it can't run 13 gig VRAM games.
Yeah. I had to stop and pause for a second. They're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, no, it's not NDA breaking. Like, yeah, people know this, right? So I've been pretty consistent with this. Like, I thought paying $400 for a 4060 Ti with 8 gigabytes of VRAM was horrifically bad. I feel like I've been vindicated on that one now. I'm sure there's people that still argue that we're fear mongering with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but you do not want an 8 gigabyte VRAM graphics card in 2025. You sure as hell don't want to be buying one in 2025 and paying a reasonable sum of money to do so. That's just not going to go well. Really, especially if, and this is always the problem I've had with the VRAM discussion, if you're not really caring about ray tracing, maybe you're using upscaling, but that's not here or there really, but you don't care too much about ray tracing, you're really focused on high frame rates in a sort of more competitive setting or games where it doesn't matter too much, like, either textures aren't that important or whatever, then VRAM doesn't really matter too much. So I guess the easiest way to give it a title is like the esports GPU. Okay. So if you're buying a GPU for those purposes, then that's fine. But if you're like GeForce GPUs are better, and I buy GeForce GPUs because I want the best visuals. I want to crank up the resolution. I want, frame generation looks better. The upscaling is better. I want all the ray tracing. Well, that's fine. But then you can't defend like an 8 gigabyte 4060 Ti. And really, you can't defend a 12 gigabyte 5070. If you're of that opinion, NVIDIA needs to be giving you, at the absolute minimum, 16 gigabytes of VRAM. So I often see a disconnect, especially in like places like r/NVIDIA, for example, between people who attack us for saying that these GPUs don't have enough VRAM, but then at the same time they're saying they're superior because of their ray tracing performance. And I'm like, all of these things that you're saying are superior require more VRAM. So it's a weird situation.
Yeah. So we'll see how the comparison between the 9070 and 5070 ends up next week. But yeah, initial reactions to that certainly were, I was expecting, there was two price configurations that I was expecting the most after seeing the briefing and everything, which was $650 and $550 for the two models respectively. That was the bad option. That was like, do not do that. And then the second option, which I was thinking was maybe less likely, was $600 and $500. The $600 with $550 option is, just weird and is kind of the okay to mediocre for the $600 card and the bad option for the $550 card. So
it's just a repeat of stupid past decisions, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know what their angle there is. Maybe they're thinking that the 5070, it can't be priced based on relative to their own models. They can't have decided $550 because of how it performs relative to the 9070 XT.
Mm-hmm.
The reasoning has to be that they think that relative to the nearest competitor, the 5070, that price works in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because there's more VRAM or something they're angling for there. And I just don't think. Again, it's like ticking off. I was talking about ticking off all the things, all the comparisons. It's like they've ticked off that thing, they've ticked off VRAM, and then they've just ignored the other stuff.
It's dumb for two reasons. It's dumb because compared to the 9070 XT, it's not good value. So that's dumb. So compared to their own product, it's very evidently dumb. And then when compared to your competitor's part, you end up with a situation where you're tossing it like, okay, well, it doesn't do this as well, but it does have more VRAM, but then it's probably not as good as at that. And which one do I buy at a similar price? Oh, I've heard GeForce drivers are just better and GeForce GPUs are better in general. So I'm just going to buy the GeForce GPU. And then no one buys the 9070. And also, I've looked up 9070 reviews and all the reviewers are saying this product's dead on arrival or pointless or it's too expensive, don't buy it. Oh, I'll just get the GeForce GPU. But if it's $500 and reviewers are like, I don't know, I'm just going to throw things out there like better raster performance, just generally better performance, more VRAM, better pricing, better position product overall, 9070, excellent value, mid-range to high-end GPU. So then someone who's tossing up between the two and they go and look at Gamers Nexus and all the other hundreds of reviews around the world, and they're like, oh, all these guys are saying it's good value and the 12 gigabyte 5070 reviews not so positive. Maybe it's time to try a Radeon GPU. Of course, what an added layer to this is the fact that AMD are speaking to GeForce owners. They're not speaking to AMD fans. They're not speaking to AMD fanboys or whatever it is, someone who's going to buy a Radeon GPU no matter what, because they've locked them in. If they want to increase market share, if they want to increase sales beyond the previous generation, they're selling to GeForce owners.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this in the last podcast. But if you've always had a GeForce GPU, you're really happy with it, you've heard that you've bought the best brand, you're getting the best experience, DLSS is the best, you've got great ray tracing performance, all that sort of stuff, whatever it may be, is 10% not going to get you to a Radeon GPU, is it? 20%? We thought it would, but evidently it hasn't. And you put it in sort of logical terms like, if you're buying anything like a TV and you want an LG TV, but one of the cheaper brands has a bigger TV with similar technology, maybe not quite as good, but it's 10% cheaper. Well, you're not going to entertain that. 20% cheaper, you'll probably look into it and do a quick and ah and then go, no, the LG. I'm sticking with the better brand, better image quality or whatever. But when it gets to 30%, pretty big chunk of change, I think that's where people start to go, you know what, I don't reckon it's worth the premium. I'm going to save the money. I think that's a pretty logical train of thought, and I think that's how a lot of people do go about it. And I've been given sales data that when Radeon GPUs did offer 30% better value, they sold. They out. I don't know if saying outsold GeForce was right, but they sold. Like they were moving serious inventory rather than just sitting there and trickling them out here and there.
Yeah, I think the pricing looks like an upsell at face value. Like, obviously, you would just spend the $50 more to get the XT model. I think that's probably not going to work for a couple of reasons. Firstly, an upsell like that, you probably don't want to make any 9070s. You want it to be basically a dead product that doesn't exist so that any reasonable person just buys the XT. So if they've made a whole stack of these 9070s and it's based on upsell pricing, those cards just will not sell, which will be like a 7900 XT situation all over again, where AMD was like, we've made tons of these because we think they're going to be really good, and then turns out they're not. So then they've got tons of them. So the upsell, in that respect, only works if they make none of them. And secondly, the upsell doesn't work anyway because there's a direct competitor to that price. So you can do an upsell like that if there's no competition. If you've got the $550 and the $600 card, no other options, you assess the market, you're like, okay, I'll just buy the $600 model because the alternative is the $550 model that makes no sense. The actual situation that's happening, though, is there's the $550 NVIDIA model, the $550 AMD model, and then the $600 AMD model. So, yeah, you might upsell people from a 9070 to a 9070 XT. Are you upselling anyone from a 5070 to a 9070 XT? And I think a lot of people, and this is what we were talking about previously, the dollar value is going to be immediately a limiting factor. People go, I want to spend about $500 on an NVIDIA GPU. What are the options? So you assess them. You got the $550 5070. Immediately as a GeForce owner, you'll be like, that's top of the list because I bought GeForce previously. Then you look, as you said, the 9070 reviews. They're bad. So you immediately cross it off the list, doesn't look competitive. Then you see the AMD product, the 9070 XT. Okay, but it's $50 more expensive. So what are they offering for $50 more? You start looking into the numbers and things, and you're like, okay, well, they're offering this much more performance, and there's better VRAM and XYZ sort of things. Maybe the ray tracing performance is similar, whatever, right? But it's $50 more. So you're having to fight against someone that's already predisposed to buy GeForce to the unknown brand with potentially some advantages, maybe some disadvantages at a higher price. And I think that's a really hard upsell. It's not as easy as just converting someone and upselling them from the obviously makes no sense 9070 to the XT. It's about the brand, changing brands, sacrificing DLSS potentially and those sort of things. And this is all solved if the 9070 XT is $550 and the 9070 is $450. The card is $100 cheaper than the 5070, so whole different range of discussions, comparisons there. And then the 9070 XT is the same price as the 5070, but I think you would find that there'd be very little reason to buy either the 5070 Ti or the 5070, because all the comparisons would likely be that the 970 XT is just faster and better in most ways.
Yeah,
So
I mean, at those price points, they blow NVIDIA out of the water. Agree with everything you've said. I mean, the main pain point for me is the fact that it leaves. Well, again, there's that negative connotation around the 9070 reviews, because the 9070, the 9070 XT, they're kind of the same thing. They sound very similar to most people, and you get all of these 9070 reviews that I'm almost certain are going to be negative because the product doesn't make sense at that price. I don't know. Like, how do you recommend anyone buy that product?
Yeah, I
That
guess
should be a situation you want to avoid at all costs.
yeah, it's not like it's reviewed in a vacuum. The reviews are not going to be 9070 versus 5070 with no other discussion points.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it just.
But again, even that, like I said, I don't know. I haven't crunched all the numbers yet. I haven't finished my 9070. My RTX 5070 review at this point in time. So the information we've given so far is just public information. I'm just putting it out there. 12 gigabyte card, quite expensive. The year's 2025. I don't think that's a great deal. Just personally, whether there's some other redeeming attributes that will shape the review and change that overall opinion, I'm not sure. But just my initial opinion, based on those specifications, don't think it's going to be a terribly great product. I'm not saying it's a complete and utter flop. I just don't think it's a terribly compelling product. So you don't want to just compete with a not terribly compelling product. Ideally, you'd like to crush that. It's an easy crush, is it not?
Well, I would have thought so, but
you would have thought so. So that's my thoughts on that. But we'll see how this all plays out over the next week. The next Hardware Unbox podcast is going to be a very interesting chat. I can't wait to get to it.
Yeah, there's going to be a few GPUs and other things to talk about after that. I guess probably to wrap up this podcast, we can talk a little bit about some of the other things that AMD's announced along with this GPU. So obviously there's some software side of things like FSR4 and so on to talk about. I think it's good. The real positive for me actually from this is not necessarily them not making it $650. It's that it seems like AMD's finally clued into the fact that you actually need genuinely reasonable software features to compete in the GPU market these days. It is no longer a situation where it's just the raster performance, that's it. As we were saying about the whole ticking of things off, people wanting cards for different things, AMD's behind in basically any software scenario that you can come up with as things stand prior to the RDNA 4 launch. They're behind in upscaling. They're behind in video encoding quality. They now with the NVIDIA app, they're probably similar in terms of the app software. So that's not an advantage they have anymore. NVIDIA's now got driver-side frame gen. They've got multi-frame gen, which, don't know whether you think that's a worthwhile feature, but they've got it.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got all their other stuff. CUDA, obviously, for developers. The AI ecosystem for AI developers. You've got the RTX HDR stuff. The list goes on. NVIDIA has better features for everything. So AMD needs to start pulling the finger out and actually fixing or bringing up to standard some of these things. And there's been some really disappointing and silly stuff that they've done over the years, like the encoding quality has been talked about a lot. And again, encoding quality is fine on an AMD GPU if you're encoded at a really high bit rate, no problems. If you're doing game streaming, many problems. They released an AV1 encoder that can't encode 1080p properly. That's a big problem. Probably never should have made that into the RDNA 3 architecture. How that slipped through, no idea. So I was very impressed with some of the claims that they've been making about, say, video encoding quality. They're claiming that low bitrate encoding and stuff, they showed some examples, is much better. And they're not hiding this anymore. They're not sort of saying, previously whenever they talked about video encoding, it was always like, hey guys, just as a footnote, our cards do AV1 now, and we recommend using that because we're not going to talk about what we do at H.264. We've got AV1 now. Now they're like, oh yeah, actually most people don't use AV1. Our H.264 encoder is way better now, and we'll show you. We'll show you exactly what it can do. So they're not shying away from that and hiding it, putting it in the bin somewhere for no one to ever discover. They're going, we've heard you guys. Encoding quality on AMD GPUs sucks, and here's what we're thinking of doing about it. We want to get people involved. They're saying it's going to, work with OBS and that sort of thing. We'll see whether any of that's true. Like, I'm not going to test encoding quality. I'm not the right person to do that sort of testing. I'm not an expert in it at all, but I'm sure people will, figure that out. They'll come to their conclusions on that. Obviously, upscaling quality. You can't just have FSR 3.1 anymore. It's not good enough. So they're now making a concerted effort to make FSR4 AI-based upscaling and actually get into games day one, not releasing FSR in 2 terrible games that no one plays. You can actually use FSR4 via the driver upgrade in 30 games at launch, which isn't heaps, but there's actual games people want to play in there, like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Spider-Man 2. New good, well-received games. They were talking about they've improved the driver-side frame gen feature. So I don't know whether people are interested in using it. I'm certainly not interested in using it, but they're putting effort into that. They're putting effort into sharpening. They're putting effort into, they're adding AI features that I'm not particularly interested in. I didn't really cover in the video, but they're putting effort into that. So no longer does it feel like you look at a Radeon presentation and it's all, here's the raster performance, and we're probably going to get the raster performance wrong and the price wrong because, they overestimated the performance of the RDNA 3 models. No longer does it seem like they're doing that. They're actually focused on, here's the things that we think gamers are actually going to be interested in, which are obviously the raster performance and value, ray tracing, encoding quality, upscaling quality. And here's all our solutions for all those things. They even did some pretty in-depth stuff on ray tracing and even talked about, path tracing, which you would never think would ever run on an RDNA GPU previously. Now they're sort of saying, well, we have some solutions for this on our cards, and we hope that those will be effective. Whether or not it's as good as NVIDIA's implementations or whether game developers use them compared to the NVIDIA solutions, not sure. But again, they're not shying away from that. They're not putting ray tracing as a footnote and sort of saying our generations can't do that. These are all the things that we're doing to improve that. So that side of the presentation where they talked about all that stuff was certainly quite, good. We'll have to see how all the features play out, whether they're actually any good. But the fact they're actually willing to talk about them instead of hiding them, I think that was sort of a positive sort of thing.
Yeah,
and then, obviously FSR4, not really sure how that one's going to play out. That's obviously a big feature for everyone to be concerned about, how that stacks up to DLSS4. I've seen it in person. I think FSR4 looks quite good based on the demo that they showed at CES. So it's certainly not an FSR 3.1 implementation. It should be much better than that. The question that I'll be looking at in the video is sort of 2 things. The first thing is it good enough to use? Because I think there's a lot of situations where FSR 3.1 is not good enough to use, and people would be, reasonably happy with the DLSS 3 sort of experience because people have been using DLSS 3 for the past 2 years and have been pretty happy with its image quality and performance in a lot of ways. So if they can get it to that level, that's kind of hurdle 1. It's usable. It's as good as implementations that people liked previously. That's in a reasonable state. And then obviously the second hurdle is, are they improving in the ways that DLSS 4 has improved relative to DLSS 3? So, there's a couple of different ways things could go there, but I think if they don't even meet that first hurdle, then it's going to be really bad. Will not close the gap. But I still imagine there will be some sort of gap between FSR4 and DLSS 4, but if they can at least make it so that 1440p, for example, you turn on DLS or FSR4 quality mode and you don't immediately go, oh my God, this looks absolutely disgusting, artifacts everywhere, which is kind of the experience you get with FSR 3.1 today. I think that will go a long way to sort of alleviating people's concerns with upscaling for this generation. I think a lot of people would be a lot happier if they could go, okay, I've tried DLSS 4, it's a good improvement, but I was using DLSS 3 previously, and that was okay, and now FSR 4 is kind of that. I think that would be that's the level where I think AMD, it would be an acceptable improvement because I'm not expecting them to be able to close. It's kind of the generation on generation thing, like with Intel GPUs or AMD GPUs. There needs to be realistic steps for them to catch up, and I'm not expecting everything to happen at once. But a realistic step is let's make FSR4 a usable technology for people. People are going to be happy using it. They're going to be satisfied. I think, let's see. Hopefully, they can achieve that. So. Yeah, that's going to help a little bit with those value things that we were talking about previously, where a lot of that was, sacrificing DLSS because it's better. Maybe you won't have to do too much of that. But again, I haven't even received a card yet, so I can't start testing it. So I haven't. It's not like I'm sitting here trying to weave around things because I know things that I can't talk about yet. Haven't started the testing. So those are just my opinions as things stand based on what's been presented so far. So any further thoughts about RDNA 4 and what's been shown off so far that we need to get into?
No, I have a headache and want to go to bed.
That is very fair. That is very fair. No boring life this episode because we've talked for too long and it's very late and I can't be bothered. Let's be honest.
Yeah, we'll make a more of an effort next week.
Yep. So, yes, thanks everyone for listening to this week's podcast episode as we break down RDNA 4. Well, it's the pricing and that sort of thing, which spent the majority of the time doing. Let us know what your thoughts are on the price and things in the comments below. We'll try to get this podcast up for people to listen to in the morning for us, which will probably be like, earlier than usual on the feeds. Don't want to say too much more. So thanks for listening and we'll see you in the next one.